My aunt let me stay in her house. That's the phrase she used, every single time, for 22 years. Let you stay. Not raised you, not loved you. Let you stay. I was 6 years old when my parents died in a car accident, and my aunt and uncle took me in, though took me in makes it sound gentler than what it actually was. My cousin Chloe got the bedroom with the window seat. I got a cot in the laundry room until I was 9, then finally a real bed, but only after my uncle complained the cot was an eyesore when guests came over. Chloe never washed a single dish in that house. I washed every dish, every night, standing on a step stool before I was even tall enough to reach the sink properly. When Chloe got sick, my aunt stayed home from work. When I got sick, I still had to fold the laundry, because, as she put it, the house doesn't run itself, and you're not made of glass. At every birthday, every Christmas, my aunt would gather the whole family around and remind everyone, warmly, generously, how they'd taken in their poor, penniless niece out of the goodness of their hearts. How lucky I was they hadn't just let the state have me instead. I believed her. For 22 years, I believed every single word of it. Then, 3 weeks ago, cleaning out my uncle's desk after his stroke, my fingers brushed against something cold and metal taped to the bottom of a drawer. A small brass key, and engraved into the fob, 3 faded letters that stopped my heart completely. My father's initials. My father, who I was told left nothing behind. Nothing but a little girl nobody quite knew what to do with. I drove to that bank the next morning with that key in my pocket and my hands shaking on the steering wheel. And what was waiting inside that box didn't just answer a question I'd been carrying my whole life. If you enjoy stories about family, quiet strength, and the moment the truth finally comes home to roost, stay with me until the very end, because what I found in that box changed everything. If this story moves you, please take a moment to subscribe to this small channel of ours. It genuinely means the world to us. My name is Nora Ellison, and for most of my life, I understood exactly where I stood in the only family I had left, even if nobody ever said it plainly. I grew up in a quiet suburb outside Columbus, Ohio, in the home of my Aunt Deborah and Uncle Frank, my mother's older sister and her husband. I moved in with them the summer I turned 6, in the weeks right after the accident that took both my parents on a rainy stretch of highway coming home from a weekend trip. I don't remember much about that time, honestly. I remember a woman in a gray coat explaining things to me slowly, the way adults talk to children they're afraid might break. I remember my aunt's living room smelling like lemon polish, and a suitcase that felt too big to be carrying my entire life inside it. My cousin Chloe was exactly my age, born 3 months apart, and for a while, in those first confused months, people used to comment on how nice it was that we'd grow up together, practically like sisters. I want you to hold on to that phrase, practically like sisters, because it's going to come up again later, in a very different way. The house itself was comfortable, a 4-bedroom colonial with a decent yard, the kind of place that photographed well for Christmas cards. From the outside, nobody would have guessed there was any difference at all between how the 2 little girls inside that house were being raised. From the inside, the difference was clear from almost the very beginning. Chloe had the larger bedroom, the one with the window seat that looked out over the backyard. I slept on a cot set up in the laundry room for the first 3 years, tucked between the washing machine and a shelf of detergent, until my uncle finally complained that it looked unprofessional whenever guests used that hallway to reach the garage. That's when I got a real bed, in a converted section of the basement, not because anyone decided I deserved better, but because my discomfort had become mildly inconvenient for their image. I want to pause here for just a moment, because before I continue, I'd be so grateful if you'd take a second to subscribe to this small channel of ours. It genuinely helps more than you'd think, and I promise, there's a meaningful story waiting for you at the end of this one. Now, let's continue. By the time I was 7, I understood the rules of that house, without anyone ever needing to spell them out. Chores were mine. Chloe's toys were Chloe's, even the ones she'd outgrown, which were never handed down to me, but donated instead, while I wore whatever secondhand clothing my aunt picked up from a consignment shop 2 towns over. Always a size too big or too small. Always slightly out of fashion by the time it reached me. My Aunt Deborah had a particular way of speaking about me to other people. A warmth in her voice that never quite matched the substance of what she was actually saying. At church, at family gatherings, she'd rest a hand on my shoulder and tell whoever was listening how blessed she felt to have opened her home to her late sister's little girl. How some families simply turned their backs when tragedy struck, but she and Frank could never have lived with themselves doing that. I was 7, 8, 9 years old, standing there while adults nodded approvingly at my aunt's generosity, and some small part of me already understood that I was being used as a prop in a story about her own goodness, though I wouldn't have had the words for it back then. The differences between how Chloe and I were raised became sharper as we got older, impossible to explain away as simple parenting preference between 2 children who happened to be the same age. Chloe attended a private Catholic school starting in 3rd grade. Small classes, uniforms, the kind of education my aunt talked about constantly at dinner parties. I stayed in the local public school, which was perfectly fine academically, but the contrast wasn't really about the schools themselves. It was about what the difference represented. One niece was worth the investment. The other was grateful for whatever she got. Birthdays followed the same pattern every single year. Chloe's birthday meant a full party, decorations, a bounce house rented for 2 summers running, a cake from the good bakery downtown with her name spelled out in careful frosting letters. My birthday, 3 months later, usually meant a store-bought cake from the grocery store, sometimes forgotten entirely until dinner was already on the table, at which point someone would remember and stick a candle in whatever dessert happened to be available. I remember being 10 years old, sitting at that dinner table while my aunt apologized to Chloe's friends for the modest cake, not because it was my birthday being overlooked, but because she was embarrassed the dessert wasn't nicer for the guests who'd come for Chloe's sleepover that same weekend, a party that had simply been scheduled to overlap with my birthday because nobody had thought to check the calendar first. Household responsibilities fell to me with a consistency that, looking back, feels almost mechanical. I was washing dishes every night by the time I was 7, standing on a wooden step stool my uncle built, specifically so I could reach the sink properly, which in retrospect strikes me as a strange kind of practical cruelty, solving the height problem instead of the underlying problem of a 7-year-old being assigned nightly dish duty at all. I did laundry by 9, vacuumed the entire downstairs by 11, and by the time I was in middle school, I was essentially managing the household's daily upkeep alongside my aunt, while Chloe's contributions extended to occasionally clearing her own plate, an act treated with the kind of praise usually reserved for genuine accomplishment. I want to pause again for a moment here, because before I continue, I'd be so grateful if you'd take a second to subscribe to this small channel of ours. It genuinely helps more than you'd think, and I promise, there's a meaningful story waiting for you at the end of this one. Now, back to it. When either of us got sick, the response revealed something I didn't fully understand until I was much older. If Chloe had so much as a mild cold, my aunt would stay home from her part-time job, set Chloe up on the couch with soup and cartoons, hover over her with genuine tenderness. When I got sick, actual fevers, actual illness, I was still expected to fold laundry from my bed if I couldn't manage the stairs. Because, in my aunt's words, delivered without any apparent awareness of how it sounded, the house doesn't run itself, and you're not made of glass. I didn't complain. Not really. Not out loud. Complaining felt dangerous in a way I couldn't fully articulate as a child, like it might remind them that taking me in had been a choice, one they could reconsider if I became too much trouble. So I stayed quiet, and I worked, and I told myself, the way children do, that this was simply what family looked like when tragedy had already taken so much from you. The narrative around my presence in that house had a specific shape that got repeated at every holiday, every family gathering, every time relatives visited from out of town. My aunt would find a moment, usually with a warm hand resting on my shoulder while I stood there, to remind everyone how generous she and Frank had been, taking in their poor, penniless niece after her parents left nothing behind. How lucky I was they hadn't simply let the state take custody instead. I heard that phrase so many times throughout my childhood, left nothing behind, that I never once thought to question it. Why would I? I was a child being told a simple, sad fact about my own history by the adults who were, according to their own frequent reminders, generously absorbing the cost of my existence. By the time I reached high school, the pattern had calcified into something I no longer actively questioned. The way you stop noticing a persistent ache after living with it long enough. Chloe drove a used but reliable sedan our aunt and uncle bought for her 16th birthday. I worked 20 hours a week at a grocery store, starting the same year, saving toward a car of my own, that I eventually bought myself at 17. A rusted Honda, with a check engine light that never quite went away. College applications became another quiet dividing line. My aunt sat with Chloe for hours reviewing essay drafts, drove her to 3 separate campus tours over one spring break, celebrated her acceptance to a respected state university with a dinner at an actual restaurant. When my own acceptance letters arrived, I remember standing in the kitchen holding one from a school with a decent nursing program, waiting for some acknowledgement, and receiving instead a brief nod and a comment about how I'd need to figure out financial aid myself, since college funds, as my uncle put it, had always been earmarked for their own daughter. I want to pause here for a moment, because before I continue, I'd be so grateful if you'd take a second to subscribe to this small channel of ours. It genuinely helps more than you'd think, and I promise, there's a meaningful story waiting for you at the end of this one. Now, let's continue. I worked through college almost entirely on my own. Loans and part-time jobs stacked on top of each other, while Chloe's tuition, housing, and living expenses were covered without a second thought. I don't say this to diminish anything Chloe herself did during those years. She wasn't cruel to me. Not directly. Not in any dramatic way I could point to as the villain of this story. She simply existed comfortably inside a system that had been built, quietly and deliberately, to favor her, and she rarely seemed to notice the difference, the way people rarely notice advantages that have simply always been there. I moved out the summer after I turned 22, into a small apartment near the hospital, where I'd started working as a registered nurse. I want to be honest about something here. I didn't leave in anger. I left the way you leave any place that has quietly told you, for 16 years, that you were tolerated rather than wanted. Quietly, without a scene, packing my own boxes, thanking my aunt and uncle for their hospitality in a way that still makes me wince to remember, because some deeply trained part of me still believed I owed them exactly that kind of gratitude. For the years that followed, I built a life that looked entirely ordinary from the outside. A nursing career I genuinely loved, a small but comfortable apartment, a quiet circle of friends who knew almost nothing about my childhood, because I'd learned, somewhere along the way, that explaining it out loud made people uncomfortable in ways I didn't have the energy to manage. I still visited my aunt and uncle several times a year, holidays mostly, out of an obligation I never fully examined. I still listened to my aunt retell the story of her generosity to whichever relatives happened to be present, still nodded along, still said thank you when the moment seemed to call for it. What I didn't know, sitting through all those holiday dinners for over 2 decades, was that the story I'd been told about my own history, that my parents had left nothing behind, that my aunt and uncle had generously absorbed the full cost of raising me out of pure family loyalty, was not simply an exaggeration. It was, in the most precise sense of the word, a lie. And the truth had been sitting quietly in a locked drawer in my uncle's desk for over 20 years, waiting for a stroke severe enough to finally bring me back into that house long enough to find it. The call came on a Tuesday morning in early spring. My Uncle Frank had suffered a serious stroke, and my aunt, overwhelmed and needing help managing the house while he was hospitalized, asked if I might come by to help sort through some of his things, mostly paperwork related to his small accounting business that he'd run out of a home office for as long as I could remember. I want to pause again for a moment, because before I go further, I'd be so grateful if you'd take a second to subscribe to this small channel of ours. It truly helps more than you'd think, and I promise, the most important part of this story is still ahead of us. I drove out that weekend, walked into a house I hadn't spent real time in for years, and spent most of Saturday boxing up decades of accumulated paperwork in Frank's cluttered home office, old tax documents, client files from his accounting practice, the kind of tedious administrative archaeology that comes with cleaning out anyone's workspace after a health crisis. It was late afternoon, my hands gray with dust, when I pulled open the bottom drawer of his old oak desk, a drawer that stuck slightly and required a firm tug to fully extend. Behind a stack of old bank statements, my fingers brushed against something taped to the underside of the drawer above it, something cold and small that definitely wasn't paper. I peeled it away carefully. A small brass key, the kind used for safe deposit boxes, with a paper fob attached by a thin loop of string. The ink on the fob had faded significantly over what must have been many years, but I could still make out 3 letters, carefully handwritten in a script I didn't immediately recognize. RJE. I sat back on my heels in that dusty office, staring at those 3 initials, my mind working through them slowly, before the realization landed with a physical weight in my chest. Richard James Ellison, my father's name. I hadn't seen my father's handwriting in over 2 decades. I barely remembered the sound of his voice at this point. Honestly, memory being the strange, unreliable thing it is when you lose someone at 6 years old. But I recognized enough of the shape of those letters, the specific way the R curled, to feel something in my chest go completely still. My father, who I had been told for 22 years, left nothing behind. My father, whose name apparently belonged on a safe deposit box key that had been deliberately hidden, taped out of sight, tucked into a drawer in the desk of the man who'd spent 2 decades telling everyone how generously he'd absorbed the cost of raising his brother-in-law's orphan daughter. I sat on that office floor for a long time before I finally stood up, slipped the key into my pocket, and finished boxing up the rest of the paperwork without saying a single word to my aunt about what I'd found. I didn't sleep much that night. I lay in the guest room of a house that had never quite felt like mine, turning that small brass key over in my fingers in the dark, running through every possible explanation that didn't involve my aunt and uncle having lied to me for over 2 decades. Maybe the key belonged to something unrelated. Maybe those initials meant something else entirely, some coincidence I hadn't considered. I tried on each of these explanations the way you try on clothes that don't quite fit, and none of them held together under any real scrutiny. The following morning, I told my aunt I needed to run some errands before heading back to my apartment. She barely looked up from the crossword puzzle she was working on at the kitchen table, waved a hand toward the door, told me to drive safely. I remember standing there for a moment, watching her, this woman who had raised me alongside her own daughter for 16 years, wondering what exactly she knew and for how long she'd known it. I want to pause here for just a moment, because before I continue, I'd be so grateful if you'd take a second to subscribe to this small channel of ours. It genuinely helps more than you'd think, and I promise, there's a meaningful story waiting for you at the end of this one. Now, let's continue. The key had a small engraved number on the reverse side, along with a partial bank name I could just make out beneath years of tarnish. First Heritage Trust. A quick search on my phone told me it was a regional bank that had merged with a larger institution about 15 years earlier, but records, I discovered with a call to their customer service line, transferred during acquisitions like that, especially for something as formal as a safe deposit box. I drove to the branch that had absorbed First Heritage's old accounts, my hands genuinely shaking on the steering wheel the entire way, adrenaline and dread tangled together in a way I hadn't experienced since childhood. The woman at the bank, a patient, gray-haired employee named Carol, listened to my explanation, examined the key, and pulled up records on her computer with a level of calm that felt almost cruel, given how loudly my heart was pounding. She confirmed that the box existed, registered under the name Richard Ellison, opened decades earlier, annual fees paid automatically through a linked account that, she noted with a slight frown, had technically been managed under a secondary authorized signer listed on the account. Frank Whitmore, my uncle's name. Not as executor of an estate, not as a temporary guardian handling paperwork for a grieving family. As an authorized signer, someone with legal access to that box for over 2 decades, someone who had been quietly paying to keep it maintained and hidden the entire time, while telling everyone, including me, that my father had left nothing behind. Because I was listed as the box's designated beneficiary, now a legal adult with proper identification, Carol was able to grant me access that same afternoon. I remember walking into that small private viewing room, my legs unsteady beneath me, watching her set a long metal box on the table and step back to give me privacy. I sat there for a moment before I could bring myself to lift the lid. Inside, carefully organized in a way that suggested my father had been a meticulous man, were several sealed folders, a small velvet jewelry pouch, and a stack of documents held together with a rubber band that had gone brittle with age. I started with the documents. The first was a certified copy of my father's will, dated just 8 months before the accident that killed him and my mother. Reading through it, my hands trembling badly enough that I had to set the pages down twice to steady myself, I learned that my father had built a modestly successful commercial real estate business over the previous decade, along with a life insurance policy and several investment accounts. The total estate, according to the will's summary page and a secondary financial statement folded alongside it, had been valued at just under $2.3 million at the time of his death. $2.3 million. Not nothing. Not the story I had been told my entire life. The will named a trust, established specifically for my benefit, to be managed by an appointed guardian until I reached full adulthood, with clear provisions for my education, housing, and general welfare to be funded directly from that trust, rather than from any personal expense on the part of whoever raised me. I want to pause again for a moment, because before I go further, I'd be so grateful if you'd take a second to subscribe to this small channel of ours. It truly helps more than you'd think, and I promise, the most important part of this story is still ahead of us. The named guardian and trustee, appointed to manage that money on my behalf until I turned 25, was my uncle, Frank Whitmore. I sat in that small private room for a long time after reading that, piecing together a timeline that made my stomach turn with each new realization. My uncle had known, from the very beginning, that raising me came with a substantial trust fund attached, money specifically designated to cover my education, my housing, my general upbringing. Instead, he and my aunt had spent over 2 decades telling everyone, including me, that they were generously absorbing the full financial burden of my care out of pure family loyalty. Meanwhile, Chloe's private school tuition, her car, her college expenses, all of it funded seamlessly by household finances that, based on what I now understood about my uncle's modest accounting practice, would have struggled significantly to cover those costs without some additional source of income quietly supplementing them. I found bank statements further back in the folder, older ones, showing regular withdrawals from the trust account over the years. Amounts that lined up almost exactly with tuition payments to Chloe's private school, with a car dealership purchased the year Chloe turned 16, with payments to the same state university Chloe had attended. My trust fund had paid for my cousin's education. My trust fund had paid for the very household expenses I'd been made to feel grateful for surviving on: the hand-me-down clothes, the store-bought birthday cakes, the years of being told how lucky I was that they hadn't let the state take me instead. I photographed every single document in that box with my phone, my hands finally steady, my mind settling into a strange, focused calm I recognized from work, the specific clarity that comes over you during a genuine emergency, when panic gives way to procedure. Then I closed the lid, thanked Carol on my way out, and sat in my car in that parking lot for nearly an hour before I felt able to drive. I want to pause one more time here, because what happened over the following weeks, contacting attorneys, confronting my aunt and uncle with what I'd found, and finally understanding the full scope of what had been taken from me, is a story I need you to stay with me for. If you believe families should never be allowed to profit from a child's grief, please subscribe to this small channel of ours before we continue. It means more than you know. The Monday morning after my visit to the bank, I didn't go to work. Instead, I drove downtown to a law firm I had researched the night before, a firm specializing in estate fraud and fiduciary abuse. I sat across a heavy mahogany desk from a sharp-eyed, silver-haired attorney named Margaret, and I laid the photographs of the documents out between us. Margaret listened to my story in complete silence. She looked at the will, the trust provisions, and the bank statements. I will never forget the expression on her face when she finally looked up at me. It wasn't pity, it was a cold, professional anger. "Nora," she said quietly, tapping a pen against the statement, showing Chloe's private school tuition. "What your uncle did here isn't just a breach of family trust. It is a massive, systematic, multi-year felony. This is textbook fiduciary fraud." Over the next 3 weeks, Margaret's firm hired a forensic accountant to trace every single withdrawal from my trust account. What they uncovered went far beyond tuition and a used car. The home improvements my aunt and uncle had done when I was 12, paid for by my trust. The vacations they took to Florida while leaving me with a neighbor, funded by my father's money. Even the mortgage on the 4-bedroom colonial house where I had scrubbed the floors and slept in the laundry room had been quietly paid off using the money my parents had left to protect me. Every single comfort they had enjoyed, every ounce of their upper-middle-class image, had been built on the theft of an orphan's inheritance. Margaret laid out my options. We could go straight to the police and file criminal charges, which would almost certainly result in prison time for my uncle, and possibly my aunt as an accomplice. Or we could pursue a civil settlement, forcing them to liquidate everything they owned to pay back the stolen funds with interest. I didn't want them in prison. Prison felt like an easy way out, a way for my aunt to play the victim one last time. No, what my aunt and uncle valued more than anything else was their image, their reputation, their carefully crafted story of being the generous, self-sacrificing saviors of the family. I told Margaret to prepare the civil papers, property liens, and settlement demands, but before she served them, I needed to do something else. I needed to finish the story my aunt had been telling for 22 years. I want to pause here for just a moment. If you have ever had to gather your courage to confront someone who hurt you, you know exactly how heavy my heart felt during those 3 weeks. If you are cheering for Nora to finally get her justice, please take a second to subscribe to this small channel. Your support truly warms our hearts. Now, let's continue. My Uncle Frank was discharged from the rehabilitation center a month later. He was using a cane and speaking a little slower, but he was recovering. To celebrate his homecoming, my Aunt Deborah organized a family dinner. She invited Chloe, who was now working in marketing downtown, along with two of my mother's cousins and their husbands. And, of course, she invited me, the dutiful, grateful niece. I RSVP'd yes, but when I got dressed that evening, I didn't put on the plain, modest clothes I usually wore to blend into the background. I wore a tailored navy dress I had bought myself with my own hard-earned nursing salary. I did my hair. I put on my mother's pearl earrings, the only physical thing of hers I had been allowed to keep. When I looked in the mirror, I didn't see the charity case in the laundry room. I saw Richard and Jane Ellison's daughter, and I was finally coming home. The smell of lemon polish hit me the moment I walked through their front door, exactly the same as it had been the day I arrived with my oversized suitcase 22 years ago. The house was loud with conversation and the clinking of wine glasses. Chloe greeted me with a quick hug, holding a glass of expensive red wine. My Aunt Deborah was holding court in the kitchen, bustling around the oven, looking every inch the devoted matriarch. When she saw me, she smiled. That same thin, practiced smile. "Nora, darling, you're here. Would you mind setting the table? The good silverware is in the dining room hutch." For 22 years, I would have nodded, walked into the dining room, and quietly done the chore. But that night, I just looked at her. "Actually, Aunt Deborah, I think I'm just going to sit with the guests tonight," I said, my voice steady and calm. She blinked, clearly thrown off balance by the minor rebellion. "Oh well, I suppose Chloe can do it." Dinner was served beautifully, as it always was. We sat around the large mahogany dining table, passing plates of roast beef and potatoes. My Uncle Frank sat at the head of the table, looking tired but pleased with the attention. Toward the end of the meal, just as I knew she would, my aunt tapped her knife against her wine glass to get everyone's attention. I want to pause again for a quick moment here. If you are enjoying this story of truth finally coming to light, please hit that subscribe button. We are a small community of strong women, and your subscription means the world to us. I promise, the look on Aunt Deborah's face is something you won't want to miss. Let's get back to the table. "I just want to say a few words," Aunt Deborah began, placing a loving hand on Frank's shoulder. "Having Frank back home, it really makes you realize how fragile family is, and how important it is to stick together." She looked across the table, her eyes landing right on me. I could see the speech coming before she even opened her mouth. "You know, when my sister passed away, people asked us how we were going to manage. We didn't have much, but we looked at little Nora, and we knew we had to step up. We made sacrifices, we did without, so that we could provide a home for a little girl who had absolutely nothing left in the world." The extended family at the table murmured in agreement, nodding with sympathetic smiles. Chloe looked at me with a soft, slightly pitying expression. I placed my napkin neatly on the table. The silence in the room seemed to sharpen as I reached into my tote bag, resting by my chair, pulling out 4 thick, sealed manila folders. "You're right, Aunt Deborah," I said, my voice cutting clearly through the quiet dining room. "You did step up, but I think it's time we talk about exactly what I cost you." I slid the first folder across the polished mahogany table, directly to my Uncle Frank. I slid the second to my aunt. The third I pushed toward Chloe, and the last one I opened in front of myself. "What is this, Nora?" my uncle asked, his voice strained, staring at the folder as if it were a snake. "That is a certified copy of my father's will, Frank," I said, dropping the title of uncle for the first time in my life, along with the trust documents he established before he died. The trust that held $2.3 million for my care, education, and housing. The color drained entirely from Frank's face. He looked like he might have another stroke right there at the table. My Aunt Deborah let out a nervous, high-pitched laugh. Nora, what are you talking about? Your father left nothing. He was terrible with money. Everyone knows. Open the folder, Deborah, I interrupted, my tone leaving absolutely no room for argument. One of the extended relatives gasped softly, but nobody moved to stop me. Chloe, her brow furrowed in deep confusion, opened her folder. She flipped past the will and landed on the bank statements my lawyer had highlighted in yellow. Wait, Chloe whispered, her eyes darting back and forth across the pages. These are from when we were kids. Mom, why is there a withdrawal for $15,000 marked St. Mary's Academy on Nora's trust account? My aunt opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Keep reading, Chloe, I said gently, because in that moment, I realized Chloe truly hadn't known. She was as much a pawn in their delusion as I was. Chloe turned the page. A withdrawal for $22,000 to Honda of Columbus, the week of my 16th birthday. She looked up, her face pale, her eyes welling with tears. You bought my car with Nora's money? It wasn't just your car, Chloe, I said, leaning forward. It was your private school. It was your college tuition. It was the vacations to Florida. It was the mortgage on this very house. For 22 years, Deborah, you paraded me around as your personal charity case, making me scrub the floors and sleep in a laundry room, while you used my dead parents' money to fund your perfect life. The silence that followed was suffocating. Frank lowered his head into his hands, trembling. Deborah stared at the documents, her carefully constructed mask of generosity finally, permanently shattered. There was nowhere left to hide. The relatives at the table were staring at her with a mixture of shock and profound disgust. We raised you, Deborah stammered, her voice shaking, trying desperately to find a defense. We kept a roof over your head. We were entitled to compensation. You were entitled to a stipend, which my father generously provided for in Section 4 of the trust, I replied, pointing to the document. You were not entitled to steal millions of dollars, to treat your own daughter like royalty, while treating me like the help. I stood up from the table, pushing my chair back. My lawyer, Margaret Sterling, will be serving you with a civil lawsuit on Monday morning, I said, looking down at the two people who had stolen my childhood. You have 30 days to liquidate your assets and return what you stole from my trust. If you try to hide a single penny, or if you fight me on this, I will drop the civil suit and press criminal charges for felony fraud, and you will both go to prison. I didn't wait for a response. I didn't need one. I picked up my purse, walked out the front door, and breathed in the cool evening air. For the first time in 22 years, I felt completely, wonderfully free. The fallout over the next 6 months was absolute. Faced with the undeniable paper trail and the threat of federal prison, my aunt and uncle had no choice but to settle. The grand 4-bedroom colonial house, the one where I had washed thousands of dishes standing on a wooden stool, was put on the market and sold. The proceeds went directly into an escrow account controlled by my attorney. They had to sell their cars, drain their retirement accounts, and hand over the equity in Frank's accounting business. The money they had stolen was returned to me, with interest, down to the very last cent. They moved into a cramped, 2-bedroom apartment on the other side of town. But worse than losing the money, they lost the one thing they truly cared about: their reputation. The extended family cut ties with them completely. The church community, once they learned the truth, stopped calling. The story of the generous aunt and uncle was dead, replaced by the ugly reality of what they had done to an orphan child. Chloe was devastated. She called me a few days after the dinner, crying uncontrollably. She apologized for everything, for every birthday she had celebrated blindly while I was ignored, for every piece of clothing she threw away while I wore hand-me-downs. I forgave her. I truly did. She was a child when the theft began, and she couldn't have known what her parents were doing. But the relationship between us was broken. She moved out of her parents' apartment shortly after, unable to look at them the same way again, and we slowly drifted apart. As for me, the money changed my life, but not in the flashy ways you might think. I didn't buy sports cars or take extravagant trips. Instead, I used my parents' money to buy a beautiful, modest little house with a big backyard and a window seat in the master bedroom. I paid off my nursing school loans, and I set up a small scholarship fund at the local community college for orphaned teens looking to get into healthcare. I want to pause here one last time. If you have stayed with me through this entire journey, please consider subscribing to our channel and leaving a comment. Hearing your thoughts and reading your stories makes all the hard work we put into these videos completely worth it. Now, let me tell you how this story ends. Last Sunday, it rained. It was a soft, steady spring rain, the kind that makes the whole world smell clean and new. I drove out to the cemetery where my parents are buried, a place my aunt and uncle rarely ever bothered to take me when I was growing up. I brought a large bouquet of white lilies, my mother's favorite, and laid them gently on the grass between their headstones. For most of my life, when I thought about my parents, I felt a deep, hollow emptiness. I felt the ache of being the burden they had left behind. But kneeling there in the damp grass, running my fingers over their engraved names, I didn't feel empty anymore. I felt overwhelmingly loved. They hadn't left me with nothing. They had spent their lives building a safety net, working hard to make sure that if anything ever happened to them, their little girl would be taken care of. They had provided for me. The fact that their money was intercepted by greedy, selfish people didn't change the fact that my parents loved me enough to leave it behind. In my uncle's desk, I hadn't just found a brass key to a bank box. I had found the truth about my own worth. I stood up, brushed the grass from my knees, and walked back to my car. I drove back to my own home, a home paid for by the love of the parents I barely knew, but will now carry with me for the rest of my life. My name is Nora Ellison. I was never a charity case. I was never a burden. I was a daughter who was loved beyond measure, and no one will ever make me feel small again. Thank you so much for spending your time with me today and listening to Nora's incredible journey. It is heartbreaking to think about the people we are supposed to trust taking advantage of us. But Nora's strength reminds us that the truth always, always finds its way into the light. If this story touched your heart, please let me know by leaving a comment below. I read every single one, and I would love to hear from you. Have you ever discovered a hidden truth that changed the way you looked at your past? If you haven't already, please hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. It is the biggest compliment you can give to our small channel, and it allows us to keep bringing these powerful, heartfelt stories to you. Until next time, take care of yourselves, know your worth, and never let anyone treat you like you don't belong. Have a beautifully blessed day, and I will see you in the next story.